Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. Learn to pace their workouts. There's kind of a typical progression that they go through from having basically no plan and just attacking everything like a crazy person and going out too hot and getting very tired and sometimes underpacing and just really not knowing where they sit on stuff to, like I said, going through a sort of typical development pattern of learning to plan, over planning, and then actually developing a solid intuition so that they can iterate on their pace sort of on the fly based upon how they feel in the moment. So what we want to talk about today is what that typical arc of development looks like for athletes and what some things are that athletes should be concerned about at each stage. Since it's a pretty common question, at least in my coaching, since a lot of what I'm doing with people is, not necessarily just writing workouts for them, but trying to teach them how to move through this sort of development, this hierarchy of pacing development so that they actually understand what they're doing and develop the capacity to make their own decisions, especially for the folks who are a little bit more competitive. But not even just them. It's a lot of the people who need to, learn proper pacing so that they can get something effective out of their training, even if they have no desire to compete, just because constantly smashing yourself or not pushing hard enough when it's appropriate to are some of the most common things that give people trouble with long-term progression. So, Luke, what do you think about this framework? Do you see something similar?
Yeah, so generally, obviously, people are starting out and they're going through workouts and they're just seeing them just as work, and there's sort of this association with, I'm going to do X and then I'm going to have all these physical adaptations that allow me to get better. But obviously training is more of a learning experience, and what you'll end up finding is that people, you've spoken about this in previous podcasts, but people basically develop compensation patterns in how they pace. So they might go through workouts in this sort of start-stop scenario. Like for instance, I've worked with people who have team sport backgrounds where it's a little bit more sort of start and stop. For instance, just playing like football, where they'll be going through a sprint and then they'll be jogging and going through a sprint, going and jogging, and then they sort of develop a capacity there, and then they try to do something similar in a CrossFit workout, and they seem to sort of almost get away with it, and they develop these compensation patterns. And I think the issue with sort of finding this work for work, or work is just work, is that a lot of people just don't necessarily pay attention to the details that's going on. So, they're not necessarily paying attention to the output that they're going through, especially if they're on, the assault bike or on the rowing machine. They're not paying attention to split times. They're not paying attention to how they move through exercises. And then as well as that, not really paying attention to the movements themselves, because obviously we have, if we look at this from a sort of a typical CrossFit model, you have monostructural, weightlifting, gymnastics, and, different movements obviously have a different effect on the body, and you have to essentially pace those differently. If you've got a barbell in your hands, there's only so many reps you can do. Whereas if you're doing burpees, you should theoretically be working at a pace where you do not have to actually physically stop. And that's one of the things I find is that you see people and they go through movements and they stop in movements that they shouldn't actually stop in, and they actually feel like they need to take a rest. And it's like, no, you just need to move slower. A typical example is bar facing burpees. And I see this all the time with people basically trying to jump, rotate at the same time, and just move through them like the elite do at this fast pace. But what ends up happening is they can't control their pace and they end up just having to physically stop. Whereas if they just went a little bit slower, they broke the movement down a little bit, there was a little bit more sort of resting points within the movement, they would be able to effectively perform more work over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I think something you mentioned in there is something I see a lot with people who, like I said, don't necessarily have a plan or have a let's call it poor understanding of the dynamics and role of pacing, right? It might be something like, let's say 10 minutes of 30 seconds of assault bike at hard effort, 30-second rest. And for their scores, right, they're like, oh, I should definitely record something. And they record, let's say, the total number of calories that they accumulated over 10 minutes, which is completely irrelevant. Like, I don't care about that at all, right? I want to see what was your split for each individual 30-second interval. I want to know how many calories did you get. I want to know what RPM or wattage you held, and I want to know what that looked like over the course of those intervals. And I think that part of the role of a coach for someone at that level is to reframe what they're thinking about, because a lot of folks coming into doing, let's say, more complex training with intervals and things like that are coming from a more typical everything is for time or everything is for a score, and I always need to have, this is my score for this piece. And that's all they really know as far as what they should be thinking about for accomplishing a training session, right? It's either just work or it's I need to get my score. And what we're trying to do is create a more nuanced understanding of saying, we actually want you to pay attention to how each round of this feels relative to the previous round. We want you to actually know what pace you can hold for 30 seconds on a bike with 30 seconds rest compared to 1 minute on a bike with 1 minute rest compared to 4 minutes on a bike with 2 minutes rest. You should have a very solid idea of what your RPM is going to look like for each of those scenarios, for example. So, in this stage, we're just really trying to increase the resolution of the way that people look at their training and give them a better framework for thinking about how those paces stack up.
Yeah. And I like sort of to, another thing that I've come across is people, for instance, hitting something like a 10-minute assault bike test, and they ask me questions. Is it going to be better for me to hit this as like 30-30 or go really hard for 15 seconds and sprint and then recover for 45? And it's like, the point of the test is actually to sort of see what you can maintain for that full 10 minutes. And I think that like what you sort of quite often see is that when people get involved in the sport and they don't necessarily have a sporting background which required them to manage fatigue in some way, right? That could range from playing sort of team sports where you are constantly on the move, or that could be, doing something like, for instance, weightlifting, where you obviously have all these numbers and these inputs, and then also, as well as that, endurance sports. What you find is when people don't necessarily have that background, the sort of like learning to plan part is actually a little bit more of a it takes a little longer, whereas sometimes you'll have people who just naturally figure things out and they naturally try to plan around it, and they start understanding, okay, well, 10 calories is going to take me X amount of time, and I can keep a cycle rate of 4 seconds for every single bar facing burpee, so I know that I'm going to be able to figure this out, figure that out. So I think what the sort of challenge you have when people are learning to plan is that they need to now start paying attention to all of the different inputs and all of the different outputs within that workout. They have to understand, okay, how long is this going to take you? And then they have to probably add on a little bit of time to, each movement. And then they have to figure out how long that workout is going to take them, and then understand that, on some days it's going to feel shitty. So you're probably not going to be able to hold those paces. And it's, one of those things is sort of when people do learn to plan, it's like you then sort of have to try to sort of teach those individuals as well to be able to deviate from the plan as well, just a little bit, and understand, okay, what's the bigger picture here? So that can be a challenge in coaching as well.
Yeah, and at that point, folks, and I think a lot of people, like you mentioned, sort of start at this stage as well of wanting to plan everything and really calculate out how long different movements take and what their split time should be on each specific round of a workout. And I think that at this stage, folks develop the capacity to plan, and then they become overly focused on their plans, and then they become potentially rigid and linear in their thinking, right? Which is that, okay, this week I was able to do this pace, so next week I should be able to increase my RPM by 1. Or if I want to get 15 rounds on this workout, I know I need to do 1 round every 90 seconds, so I'm going to watch the clock and try to start my next round at 90 seconds every single time and sort of see what happens, right? That they get this very structured way of approaching things, and they think that by being structured and planning, that they can then sort of force a specific result to happen, either in terms of their adaptation or in terms of their specific result on a test. And that in and of itself becomes problematic too, because these folks now have learned to plan, and then they need to learn to actually react to real life and what's happening, rather than just thinking that they can create a spreadsheet and force their performance or their results to fit into it.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I've sort of found with individuals in trying to teach them to plan is that it's trying to get them to pay attention to sort of the feedback from their body, and not necessarily using the other training pieces to inform how they approach this. For instance, okay, if you're going through some linear strength work, you're looking to add a couple of kilos to the barbell each week, something along those lines. I think that, when you're looking at energy systems, this type of stuff takes a lot longer to develop. And I think that's a common misconception. People all the time are talking about how, it takes a lifetime to build strength. I actually think it takes longer to actually develop capacity, especially in CrossFit as well, because it's so varied, and you can't necessarily just think of it as being like, okay, cool, like now my rowing times have gone down, my Metcon times have gone down. There's so many different variables that are going on. And I think that what I think people have to try to understand is a little bit more of an RPE based sort of approach, where they are taking into account, okay, what's going on? How am I feeling? How's my breathing? How's my heart rate? Am I getting really hot today? Whatever it is, like they start to take on board all of these different pieces of information to inform what they're about to do in that session, so they can maximize the result. And I think one of the things is also, you see people putting up percentages for their sort of like RPE within conditioning, whether it be mixed work or whether it be cyclical work, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, that is the percentage, and it's like, I have to hit that. It's like, no, it's not like weightlifting. It's okay if it was a little bit slower than last week. It's okay, if you feel great, I'll bring it up a little bit. But the goal is start paying attention to your breathing, start paying attention to, your legs starting to get jacked up on the assault bike, start paying attention to all these different things. And with elite athletes, what you probably find is these people just naturally do that. They have a knack for it, where they have an athletic background that just allows them to figure these things out. And I think that what quite often happens is that when you hear them talking about pacing and all of these types of things, they very much go along, I just went by feel, and I just did this, and I just went as hard as I could, and that's probably what was going on through their head. But they almost have like these internal mechanisms that they're not necessarily aware of, which allow them to do well in those situations, which most people aren't equipped with. So when people hear that, they're like, well, that's what I need to do. And because that's what the elite are doing, it's like, probably not. It's like, if you're paying attention to that type of stuff, probably means that you're not even elite. So you probably need to go about it in a bit of a different way. And you do see this a lot. And I was talking to you earlier with about the example of Matt Frazier. It's like, okay, this guy has a weightlifting background. He understands when the bar feels heavy. He understands when things are feeling snappy and good. And he takes on all of those experiences. Obviously in weightlifting, sometimes you're working off of percentages. Sometimes you're working off of feel. You're probably, unless he was following some Bulgarian method, he's not trying to max out every day, right? He's trying to maintain good quality technique, good quality movement. And he brings that learning into 21:15:9, row 5K, and all those different scenarios. And he has a bit more of an understanding of, okay, this is how the body works, and this is how I go through it. He may not talk about that, but he probably has that awareness inside him that, he doesn't. I'm not too sure if he talks about it or not. But I think that quite a lot of elite athletes have that.
Yeah, for sure. There's an intuitive ability to react to the scenario and do the appropriate thing, right? Which is what I think is the top of the hierarchy that we're discussing today. And I wanted to circle back to something that you started to touch on a little bit, and I know we've mentioned on other podcasts as well, is this concept of actually having specific prescribed paces that people should be going at, right? I mean, we mentioned a second ago that it might be deleterious for an athlete to approach every workout with like, okay, my split needs to be 115 on the dot for every single round. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. That doesn't give them a lot of wiggle room to modify or to sort of handle the fatigue that's going to automatically pop up doing anything. but that especially for athletes who are in this kind of learning to plan phase, or potentially even over planners, to actually give them as a coach a specific thing that they should do and see what happens can give them that framework to actually start to learn how to adjust and modify things based upon feel, right? So for folks in this stage, it potentially makes more sense to say to them, here's what's going to happen. You're going to row 500 meters at a 155 per 500 meter pace. Then you're going to get off and you're going to do one clean every 15 seconds for 10 reps, and you're not going to miss any reps. And that's a pretty tightly prescribed piece. It doesn't give them a lot of wiggle room to mess around with other than the weight on the barbell. But with something like that, then you as a coach can sort of dictate to them, this is what I want you to experience and feel. And then hopefully by doing a bunch of things like that, you can build up enough reference experiences to understand how you react to different paces and how you react to different barbell weights and how you react to doing something like cleans on, a 10-second interval versus a 30-second interval. And then all of that learning should then come together further down the line to sort of push people up that hierarchy.
Yeah, like I think I've used that a couple of times before with athletes that are a little bit more on top of like video, where I'm able to sort of see their metcons. I can play at double speed, and then all of a sudden I'm figuring out, okay, you are resting a long time in between movements. So it's almost you essentially just delegate everything within the workout and the flow, and it's just the focus is on just following that order and not necessarily, trying to achieve as much as you can. I think that can be useful. And then also, as well as that, sort of giving people specific guidelines on, pacing on the rowing machine or on the assault bike or ski erg or whatever it is. Like, those tools are great for teaching. And I think that, what's interesting is that you do see people who are sort of posting up like 45 minutes of like 30 on 30 off at exactly the same paces. And that is great. And I think that like in terms of developing capacity and the ability to hold those paces, I think is great. But I think that is also sometimes that can be sort of taken a little bit too far as well in terms of like understanding that there is a little bit more chaos that's involved within the sport. And it's like, okay, what level of transference does that have to 21:59 in your usual CrossFit? For instance, a couple of rules I use is like with people, it's like, okay, you have sort of a two-stroke rule, because I think a lot of people, when they get fixated on paces on, say, for instance, the rowing machine, it's like, okay, as soon as you drop out of your range, you have 2 strokes to get back into it. If you find that you have to repeatedly do that, then you are going to move that range. And it's trying to get people just to be able to like, okay, give them guidelines, then make those adjustments. That is going to be what allows for that sort of like long-term success, because you're sort of creating a little bit more wiggle room so they can then actually find themselves within a bit of a system, and then they can develop their own systems from there, so they can then apply that to other things that they do as well, right? Whether it's wall ball, okay, I'm going through this and I have my range is 10 to 15 reps. I have to try and hit that. And then if they find that their legs or their shoulders are getting jacked up from that, and then they don't hit that 10 reps repeatedly twice, it's like, okay, we shift that now. We got a 6 to 10 range that we're working at, and letting people just be okay in those situations as well. Because I think that, one of the things of giving people plans and making people work by plans is there's a lot of panicking going on as well. So if they don't hold those paces, so the sort of systems that I try to use are giving people the option, and is working a little bit more off ranges. I do try to start out with a little bit more of like rate of perceived effort, see where they're at, basically just give them a guideline. Okay, this needs to be exactly the same pace constantly, and then work off that. Sometimes then putting up paces. But I think that you said before as well, like sometimes you work with people who overpace, and they actually need to learn what it's like to hold 1,300 calories per hour as a pace on the rowing machine when they're going through whatever workout it is. Like they almost need to actually potentially go through those positions where they don't necessarily perform as well as they would, and they might actually have to cope with sort of more fatigue management scenarios, because that's part of the learning process as well. Because there's sort of like the Mike Tyson quote about getting everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth, and it's like, okay, so you in sort of coaching you have to facilitate both scenarios, where it's be very prescriptive, do this, give people systems to work within, and then also, hey, I sort of want you to like dig yourself into a bit of a hole here just to sort of see how you cope with it.
Yeah, there's a stage where a lot of folks go through that they end up overpacing everything, right? Because they used to attack everything with no plan and sometimes would blow up and sometimes would do well, and they didn't have a good understanding of why that might be happening to them. And then once they learn, oh, I need to go into everything and have an idea of how I'm going to fraction my toes to bar, or I should, attempt to hit 63 RPM on my assault bike calories for this type of scenario, that they get all of those little heuristics in place, and then they start sticking to them pretty much all the time, which is better than having no plan. But then, like you mentioned, Luke, they start to overpace everything, where they're rarely getting into that uncomfortable state that they used to be in all the time, which at some level is good because we're building sustainability. But what I think actually happens over time is that people get better and they don't necessarily adjust their paces based upon that. Right? That they sort of say, okay, this is my pace that I stick to now. And it's like, well, actually, you used to have no idea what you're doing. And now you at least understand the concept of pacing. And you've been working on it for 3 months. So you've actually built up a significant amount of capacity in terms of being able to sustainably do a lot of mixed work. And so you actually can just go faster now because you're better as an athlete. That you used to be like a 63 RPM athlete, and now you're a 65 RPM athlete. So there can be those moments where you got to just prod people, like you mentioned, to force them to go a little bit faster.
Yeah, and I think that we sort of obviously, like with people getting prepared for the Open now, that's something that probably is coming up in people's training a lot more. It's like, okay, here you go, here's a 7-minute AMRAP Open pace, and they're like, what does that mean? It means do what you can to make sure you get the best score possible, and don't leave anything behind, because that's the only thing you're going to be doing today. So yeah, that's one of the things that when people sort of make those, and I think we touched on it last week, I think, or like in one of the previous podcasts where we were talking about, it's good just to have those sort of those like weekly bits of chaos and sort of competition style workouts where you have that ticking over in the background because it's your sport and you have to learn how to play that. But obviously training and sort of more from like a strength and conditioning perspective, you have to, look at trying to develop these capacities and trying to develop certain qualities that are going to come up in those competition style workouts and things like that.
Yeah, and that once you develop this capacity to understand your paces and to actually have a plan, that the highest level of the hierarchy is having that intuition that you're talking about. And, it's not something like, oh, okay, we need to make sure that you have all of these scenarios perfectly mastered before we can start exposing you to the chaos of the sport, right? That I think that in and of itself is not a great way to approach things. We've talked about this in analogies to other field sports where, if you want to get better at soccer, for example, and you get some the way that people approach the curmudgeonly weightlifting coach who is like, you will never do anything other than a PVC pipe until it's absolutely perfect, right? And like, I understand where people are coming from with those ideas, but if you're trying to play soccer and it's like you're only doing drills, then you're not going to get very good at soccer no matter how good you get at your drills, because at some point you actually have to be exposed to the fact that there's other humans with their own intentions trying to get in your way. And that's one of the key aspects of performing well in the sport. And so for our sport, one of the key aspects is responding to chaotic situations with a lot of stuff where things start to fall apart. And the workout is designed in a way where, you got pretty good at rowing at this pace and then doing an upper body pushing movement and then doing a hinging movement, because that all kind of makes sense together. But then it's like, actually, literally everything that you're going to do is going to tax this exact same muscle in your rotator cuff, and it's just going to completely blow up. And guess what? Every workout is going to be like this over the course of this competition that you signed up for, or this qualifying series that you're doing. And you're like, well, that's stupid. And it's like, well, that doesn't matter because that's what you get to do. So developing the ability to react to that and sort of develop an appropriate plan on the fly is what we actually need to be training. So we probably need to be touching on that pretty much all the time in some capacity. But as people move up this hierarchy of being able to pace properly, that more and more of their training can start to look like that because they're better at adapting to it. They can handle the chaos better, and it's practice for what they're going to actually need to do in a competitive scenario for them.
Yeah, it's you have to get pretty used to high volume knee flexion if you want to do well in CrossFit. Like, I've just had an athlete go through a qualification, and it's sort of, okay, you did over 100 thrusters yesterday, and now you have to do, X amount of wall ball today, and it's sort of, it's set up in that way. So I think, you people have to definitely get used to these situations, as well as that, get used to sort of going against other people as well. There's sort of, there is a sort of, in this sort of framework. I think that obviously when you develop that like intuition ability, then you have to then start thinking about, in a competition, I might need to actually push when I don't feel like it, or when it's probably not going to be the best thing for me to do, in order for me to, keep a lead in a workout or something like that, because then it actually becomes about racing. But I think up until that point where you are sort of developing the intuition, it is about trying to sort of understand yourself as an athlete, what your capabilities are, creating the best athlete that you can out of that, creating as much awareness about that, and then from there it's, okay, now we need to learn how to race. Now we need to learn how to sort of do this in a bit more of a chaotic environment.
Yeah, and that other athlete is just another input into the scenario that you need to be able to develop an intuition about, right? It's not just, okay, this is how I feel on chest to bar pull-ups. It's, how do I feel about someone being ahead of me on chest to bar pull-ups, in addition to how I feel about my own ability. So yeah, that's just another variable that people need to be able to react to. So we got to cut this one a little bit short. I think this is a pretty good discussion, but I got to jump on a flight soon. So quick review. A lot of people go from having basically no plan in approaching conditioning workouts and just kind of going for it and seeing what happens, to developing potentially too much planning, right? Being overly rigid in their expectations and sticking to numbers too much and creating exact fractioning strategies and all that stuff. And then following that, people tend to overpace and not actually train relative to their improving capacity, and or pace themselves off of things that they saw someone else do that they can't do, and they think that just by knowing someone's split times who's better than them that they can stick to it, but that doesn't tend to work very well. And that once people sort of go through those stages of no plan, then actually learning to plan and the pitfalls that can come with that, then ideally they start to develop an intuition for themselves about how they sit on things, and are able to make intuitive decisions about how they should fraction things, what pace they should go, and just sort of respond to the varied scenarios that are going to show up in different environments, whether that's, serious competitions or just wanting to be the best in their class or the gym for the day.
I just got a flashback to, I forget who it was, but I think some people were doing, it would have been 13.1 to like a metronome to like
Is
hold
that the
paces.
burpee one?
The burpee and the snatch one, it was like, do it to a metronome, and it's like, yeah, what happens? Like, okay, you one elite athlete is able to do it, but what happens when someone is not able to do it? It's just like this becomes like Chinese water torture. The noise.
Yeah, I mean, it's like giving someone a meal plan, right? Where it's like, okay, sure, this makes sense. Some percentage of people are going to be able to do it based upon their lifestyle and their discipline. But the reality is that most people aren't. And then they're going to deviate from the meal plan, and then everything is going to immediately fall apart. It's like, that's just not very helpful. It's just not a helpful way to approach it. Don't do that. Yeah. There's better ways.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.